In this video, I will talk about waves of Italian migrations to the United States. I will discuss the timeline and the different periods made by various migrant groups, the places and the areas they settled in, how they contributed to the U.S. economy, and how these people were treated in America. Now, particularly, there are a few major waves of these groups, such as the ones from 1890 to 1920 and the ones from the post-World War II era. The first group I'm going to elaborate is the one that arrived from the earliest known period from 1921 to 1775. This group first landed on American soil during the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. This is the period when European explorers began sailing oceans in order to discover new land and claim them for riches, personal glory, or simply for their respective countries. These explorers brought along with them skilled workers and farmers in order to create new settlements. Also, Italy in the 15th century was divided into independent city-states. Although these city-states made the country prosperous, these states would wage war with one another in order to seize control of the other. This is likely a reason a number of Italians migrated to the Americas in order to escape the violence and other political conflicts surrounding them and form a new life. From there, Italians are then considered to be one of the first settlers of the United States, building homes, establishing local businesses, and became one of the early founders of America. One great example is Christopher Columbus, the first explorer who voyaged to and reached the Americas. Another notable figure is Amerigo Vespucci, whose name where America comes from. This initial group mostly dwelled in states along the East Coast, such as New York and New Jersey, but also found themselves in lands which would now be known as Arizona and New Mexico. Most of them were either Catholics or Protestants, sharing and spreading Christianity to the neighboring natives. The second I'm going to discuss is the one that took place from 1890 to 1920. A mass emigration from Italy to the United States occurred, with an estimation of 13 million Italians that landed ashore on American soil, making it the largest voluntary emigration in history. In 1920, 4 million Italians on Ellis Island represented over 10% of America's foreign-born population. Most of these immigrants came to the U.S. having little to no formal education and having no knowledge of the English language at all. Moreover, they generally consisted of peasant farmers, implying that they are at stage 2 of the demographic transition, which meant communities carrying agricultural practices and having high birth rates. Plus, they most likely came from southern Italy. These circumstances motivated them to migrate to America, which eventually determined several push and pull factors. The push factors that drove them to move out of their home country was the unfair and harsh treatment they experienced. As I mentioned earlier, all, if not most of these immigrants were southern Italians. Unlike the northern part of Italy, which enjoyed the benefits of modernization and industrialization, southern Italians suffered military and political oppression, unjust tax obligations, and mandatory military conscriptions. Because of these circumstances, southern Italy's economy worsened and eventually those people faced crippling poverty. Rather than die from hunger and other severe conditions, they ultimately decided to move to the U.S. and provide for themselves and their families. The pull factors that persuaded them to emigrate was the fact that the United States provided numerous unskilled labor jobs, such as working in factories, building railroads, and constructing buildings, since most of them were poor, illiterate, and had no access to formal education. Most of them landed ashore on Ellis Island where the immigration inspection took place, and most of them likely had no papers to show to the immigration officers. However, this did not prevent them from being able to enter the country and establish new lives. Also, this process took approximately 3 to 5 hours, which primarily depended on checking the immigrants' physical health. Like the early Italian immigrants, these people then dispersed largely on states by the East Coast, such as New York, Illinois, Philadelphia, and Pennsylvania, and formed communities and establishments which would be known today as Little Italies. Despite being accepted into the United States, Italian immigrants were not exempt from the hardships like most foreign groups experienced. In the early 20th century, these Little Italies were squalid, heavily polluted, overcrowded, and had other substandard conditions that basically made those communities unlivable. Diseases, such as tuberculosis and other communicable illnesses, greatly affected the individuals in those communities. On top of that, they also faced government discrimination and oppression from native-born Americans. One notorious example is the 1924 Immigration Act, which mainly barred Asians and other immigrants originating from the Eastern Hemisphere From 1901 to 1914, an average of 210,000 Italians arrived at U.S. shores per year. However, in 1924, it was sharply reduced to 4,000 per year, favoring the ones from Anglo-Saxon and Germanic descent. As a result, more Italians left the country rather than enter as immigrants. As I mentioned earlier, they also faced blatant oppression and cruelty. As opposed to the Protestant majority in the United States, most, if not all, of these immigrants were Roman Catholics. History will tell us that the U.S. has had anti-Catholic beliefs and sentiments brought by the early British Protestant settlers. Additionally, the difference in their religions caused glaring tensions and conflicts between them. In fact, religion was one of the reasons the Ku Klux Klan expressed hatred toward the Italians and targeted them simply because they practiced Roman Catholicism and were not of Anglo-Saxon or Germanic origin. Furthermore, in the 1930s, the KKK organized a number of protests in New Jersey against Italian neighborhoods, which comprise around more than 10% of the state's population. Another notorious example of anti-Italianism in the United States is the March 14, 1891 New Orleans lynchings, when 11 Italian Americans were murdered in New Orleans, Louisiana, because they were alleged to have assassinated New Orleans police chief David Hennessy. Because of the rising hatred against Italian Americans, suspicion against the Italian community increased. Thus, a mob broke out and went to the jail holding those 11 prisoners and shot them to death and lynched their corpses after. Also, from 1941 to 1943, at the height of World War II, Italian Americans were placed in internment camps and registered as enemy aliens by United States government. Likewise, they were issued with enemy alien registration cards in order to be identified by the military, police, and other federal officials that would cautiously deem them as potential adversaries against the American government. Although they confronted cruelty and brutal opposition in the late 20th century and early 21st century, the Italian immigrants highly influenced the United States in plentiful ways, namely cuisine, restaurants, wine production, architecture, music, and other forms of art that has become part of the present modern life in the United States. Pizza, pasta, cappuccino, and gelato are a few examples of Italian foods that became a staple of American cuisine. Respectively, they were also able to establish a few churches and schools nationwide. One good illustration is the founding of Montessori schools and a few Catholic and even Protestant churches. Many actors, directors, musicians, and talk show hosts are of Italian-American descent. Famous figures such as Al Pacino, Frank Sinatra, Sylvester Stallone, Ariana Grande, and Quentin Tarantino are notable examples who made an impact in Hollywood and pop culture in general. Today, many of their works are considered to be classics and continue to receive praise from critics and the public alike. Like immigrant groups such as the Irish, the Italians were able to rise from poverty and great struggle. Although they had a rough start, Italian Americans eventually assimilated with their neighboring communities and became successful throughout the ages. That is all that I have to elaborate about the Italian immigrants in the United States and how they became Italian Americans. Thank you for your time.